Revenge with Karen.
I knew the air had changed the moment Derek laughed. It wasn't a funny laugh. It was that sharp, smug chuckle people do when they want a room to turn against you. We were mid-leadership sync, and I had just, gently, professionally, flagged that we were overdue on 2 vendor attestations and hadn't updated the control matrix since the reorg. Derek, the freshly imported VP of Operations, leaned back in his chair, fingers laced behind his head like he'd just solved world peace. Then came the chuckle. "She's too focused on audits," he said, loud enough for the whole Zoom grid to hear. "We need velocity, not librarianship. Librarianship." I sat frozen, not because it hurt, though it did, but because I knew what that tone meant. I'd heard it before, 15 years ago, when I was the quiet compliance girl who didn't drink at company parties and didn't laugh at finance bro jokes. That laugh was always the opening volley, and it always ended with someone like me getting erased. By the end of the week, the chain of control I'd spent over a decade refining was a murder scene. Dead processes everywhere. Vendor documentation wiped clean for efficiency. My budget slashed by 60%. My direct reports, 3 of the smartest, steadiest compliance analysts I've ever had, scattered across teams where they now reported to product leads with velocity fever dreams and 0 regulatory sense. Derek didn't demote me on paper, of course. That would have required HR. No, he just starved the position until it collapsed in place. I still had the title, still had the badge, just no authority, no meetings, no access. And when I did speak up, on the rare occasion I was invited, I got the smirk. That corporate smile men give when they think you've forgotten how indispensable you used to be. I didn't argue. I didn't send a desperate email to legal or make a scene in Slack. What I did do, quietly, methodically, obsessively, was archive everything. Every overwritten control, every deleted vendor contract, every policy edit that went through without my sign-off. I made backups of backups, printed the metadata, stored encrypted copies on a flash drive that never left my purse. Because here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you all the time in the world to prepare for the day they regret it. Also, real quick, if you're listening to this and nodding because it feels familiar, maybe you've seen someone like Pamela get sidelined for knowing too much and playing politics too little. Hit that subscribe button, like the video. 93% of you don't. I swear it's like auditing in the dark. It really does motivate the team to keep these stories coming. All right, back to the disaster. Derek's version of modern operations was a confidence scam wrapped in buzzwords. He launched something called Operation Velocity, a series of sprints designed to optimize contract flows and reduce audit drag. Translation: gut the documentation process and pray no one asks questions. His favorite move: cutting mandatory review steps and calling it streamlining. He turned policy acknowledgments into optional surveys, dropped vendor recertifications from annual to when deemed necessary. When someone in finance asked if that was compliant with ISO protocols, Derek waved it off. Protocols are guidelines, not prison bars. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. But I kept archiving. Every memo, every stripped clause, every Slack thread where I flagged a risk and got a thumbs-up emoji in response. I named the folder restoration insurance. And every night before I logged off, I added one more entry. Just in case. Because one day, someone was going to ask where the skeletons were buried, and I wanted to make damn sure I had the map. Derek's first official initiative as VP was something he called Fastlane Vendorization. It sounded like a Monster Energy drink mixed with a marketing conference, and it was just as reckless. Within a week, he'd signed 3 new partnerships with tech vendors I'd never heard of, one of which I later discovered had an expired SOC 2 certification and an address that linked back to a WeWork in Des Moines. I flagged it, politely, discreetly, sent a note to procurement and CC'd Derek, saying, "Hey, couldn't find the due diligence package for Virlo Systems. Do we have their third-party risk assessment on file?" Derek replied in 6 words, "You're the past. Let the future move." That one got printed. Date, time, message ID. Slid right into my growing binder of things that would come back to haunt him. I started calling it restoration insurance because someone had to clean up after the crash. And crash it would. The paper trail didn't just fray, it disintegrated. Every vendor brought in under Fastlane came with missing paperwork. There were no data protection impact assessments, no financial stability screenings. One vendor's compliance letter expired 6 months ago, and still had the wrong legal entity name on it, certisage with an extra E, like it was written by someone drunk on typo juice. Another hadn't signed our standard risk waiver, and Derek's solution: let's just get them into production and catch up later. Later. That word is a landmine in compliance. Later is where the lawsuits live. Later is where breach liabilities curl up and wait for someone to slip. But Derek wielded later like it was some genius innovation. Every time I brought up a gap, he smiled and said, "Pam, you worry too much. We're not curing cancer. We're optimizing delivery." I didn't bother telling him that our biggest client, Corday was in biotech. We were legally bound to stricter controls under the HIPAA-adjacent clause buried in their MSA. He wouldn't have listened. Or worse, he would have smiled again and said, "That's a downstream risk. Downstream risk, like the Colorado River's gonna deal with our audit failures." Meanwhile, the actual compliance infrastructure began to rot. Review cycles were skipped. Access logs weren't maintained. Vendor scorecards disappeared entirely. He brought in a new project manager, kid fresh out of a coding boot camp who thought GRC stood for Great Resource Control, and handed her my old responsibilities. She renamed our shared folder to Ops Vibes. Ops Vibes. You know what else disappeared? The policy acknowledgement tracker. I asked where it went and was told they were rethinking friction. I nearly choked on my coffee, so I started building a parallel universe, my version of the truth. I used a thumb drive, not the cloud, kept it air-gapped, encrypted, hidden under the removable floor panel in my Honda, right next to a Costco receipt from 2019 and a spare charger cable. Every time Derek approved a vendor without a background check, I saved the request. Every time someone forwarded me a file marked final, I ran a hash comparison against the prior version and saved both. People think compliance is boring. They don't understand. It's forensic science with a badge and no gun. Collect evidence. Build a narrative. Prepare for the day someone says, "No one told us this was wrong," and you get to slide a document across the table with their initials on every page. Derek was giving me material faster than I could file it. Vendor by vendor, clause by clause, he was stitching a parachute made of spiderwebs and convincing the board it was bulletproof. I kept my voice low, my face calm. But inside, I was tallying every breach of protocol like rosary beads. Because one day, the audit gods were going to come knocking. And when they did, I was going to answer. It hit the Slack channel like a thunderclap at a funeral. Regulator confirmed. Surprise review, 3-year window. All contracts over $200M. Response due in 7 business days. 7 business days to prepare for a full-scope regulatory audit covering the deepest trenches of our contractual history. 3 years' worth of risk frameworks, vendor compliance, change logs, and every dotted I and crossed T that made the difference between a clean bill and a consent decree. My inbox stayed silent. My calendar, still blissfully empty. No invite, no call, no mention. And that was my answer. I watched from the periphery as Derek reacted exactly the way men like him always do when the stakes turn real. He shrugged, smirked, and cracked a joke. They never dig deep. We just need the headlines, not the footnotes. Someone in product laughed. Someone else looked visibly nauseous. Derek threw the prep to Kayla, the same bootcamp PM who thought regulatory controls were optional guardrails. She called her first meeting audit blitz planning, threw together a Google sheet with multicolored tabs, and kicked things off by saying, "Let's just knock this out like a group project in college." College, Jesus Christ. I stayed out of it visibly. No objections, no offers of help, because helping would mean co-signing the disaster in progress. And I wasn't about to get framed for a fire I'd spent a decade preventing. Instead, I kept tabs like a ghost. I sat in the far end of the floor, listening to their frantic hallway chatter. The file cabinet of my mind stayed open. I noticed when they mixed up version 6 of the vendor risk matrix with version 4. I noticed when Kayla cited the wrong data use policy during her dry run with legal. And I especially noticed when someone from finance asked for the updated clause 14.2 binder. And Kayla said she didn't know what that was, had no idea the audit scope included Section 14 of the Data Control Addendum, the one I'd built from scratch after that Corday near disaster in 21. The one that required real vendor attestations, not just checkbox compliance. The one that had teeth. But Derek didn't want teeth. He wanted polish, speed, slides. So they spent 4 days designing the world's prettiest cover page. Meanwhile, half the required documentation sat incomplete or missing. And nobody thought to cross-reference what had changed in the control chain since Derek's reorg. I did. Every night after they went home, I added another entry to restoration insurance. My folder was nearly full now. Flash drive backed up. Metadata preserved. It was less a file at this point and more a time capsule, proof that someone had cared enough to do it right. Remember what mattered when everyone else was chasing PowerPoint applause. On day 5, Derek rolled out a war room in the large conference space and stocked it with Red Bull, bagels, and mood lighting. He posed for a picture with Kayla next to a whiteboard that said "Get compliant, stay cool." I walked past that room once, just once, and heard Kayla say, "I think we can just swap in a recent attestation." No one's gonna compare signatures from 2020. It was wrong, dead wrong. These weren't casual auditors. This was the Regulatory Review Bureau, the RRB, and the RRB had a habit of asking the kind of questions that made CFOs cry and general counsels sweat through their blazers. I knew what was coming. I could feel the tension tightening like piano wire beneath the floor tiles. The gaps were too big. The dates wouldn't line up. The controls had been shredded and stapled back together with pure optimism. And Derek, still smiling, still cracking jokes, still calling me Audit Pam to his cronies like I was some relic from the before times. What he didn't know was that I hadn't just kept the documents. I'd kept the proof of who changed them. The logs, the deltas, the edits done at 11:59 p.m. the night before signature deadlines. Everything. Because it was never about saving my job. It was about saving the truth. The audit was coming, and it was bringing fire. The audit team didn't walk in like a storm. They floated in like fog. No suits, no briefcases, just 3 people in muted business casual with black binders, government badges, and that unnerving calm you only see in coroners and tax investigators. One of them, a short woman with a gray streak in her bun and a clipboard like it was a weapon, didn't even say hello. She looked straight at the war room whiteboard, where someone had doodled "Let's knock this audit out of the park," and raised one eyebrow. Derek extended his hand and launched into the charm offensive. "Welcome to Certisage. We're excited to walk you through our updated compliance framework. Very proud of the velocity we've achieved." Velocity. The lead auditor didn't take his hand. She just nodded at the table. "Let's begin with vendor lineage on the Corday contract, start to finish, with corresponding attestations and data flow documentation." Derek blinked. We can definitely get you a high-level summary today. And then, if helpful, a more comprehensive, we'd prefer the actual documentation. They didn't want summaries. They didn't want slides. They wanted blood. And Derek, poor bastard, had shown up with a PowerPoint and a dream. The room went still. I sat at the far end, tucked in the corner near the coffee bar, kind of position meant for interns or forgotten employees. No one had introduced me. I hadn't spoken a word. But one of the auditors glanced at me for half a second when Derek fumbled a question about vendor encryption levels, like she knew. Like she'd already read the metadata and saw my name stamped on the original documentation. Kayla passed out folders that were too light, too glossy. One had the title "Audit-readiness Toolkit." It was a PDF exported from Canva. The auditors flipped through the pages. Page, pause. "Who prepared this vendor summary?" The man in glasses asked, tapping a section labeled "Third-Party Risk Confidence Report." Kayla raised her hand. That was me, based on notes from Derek and some of the legacy folders. "Which legacy folders?" the woman asked, still not looking at her. Kayla hesitated. We kind of compiled across different sources. Some of it might have been updated post-reorg." Silence. They scribbled notes. No emotion, no nods of encouragement, just ink on paper and the sound of reputations being quietly autopsied. Derek shifted in his chair. "Of course, if there are gaps, we're happy to clarify in a follow-up email. Let's proceed to Clause 14 of the Data Control Addendum." The air thinned like someone had opened a vacuum. Clause 14. My clause. The one Derek had gutted, renamed, patched together like a Frankenstein with a marketing degree. I felt Kayla glance toward me, brief, panicked. Derek, ever the optimist, smiled wider. "We've streamlined that section recently. Simplified the language for greater accessibility. Who authored the original?" Silence. I sipped my coffee. Derek cleared his throat. "That predates the current leadership, but the intent has remained consistent." The woman cut him off. "We're not interested in intent. Need original authorship and change history for all revisions tied to data transfer across borderless cloud storage. That includes vendor subprocessors and their respective compliance attestations from 2020 through 2023. The pen scratched. The clock ticked, and Derek looked like he'd just realized he brought a butter knife to a gunfight. Still, no one looked at me. Still, I said nothing. Because in chess, you don't rush the checkmate. Let them play their pieces first. You let them expose the king. And Derek, bless him, had no idea he'd already walked into the final 10 moves. I watched from my seat, stone-faced, invisible by design, because they weren't looking for me yet. But when they did, they'd find everything. Clause 14.2, the lead auditor said, tapping the table with her pen like it was a gavel. Vendor access logs, data localization attestations, subprocessor approval trails. From 2020 forward, please provide the documentation. The words landed like a dropped scalpel in an operating room. Precise, cold, irrevocable. Derek, who'd been writing the audit like it was a TED talk with extra lighting, finally blinked. He reached for the binder in front of him, one of 5 pristine white lace folders with matching spine labels that Kayla had proudly laid out like decorative candles. Opened it, flipped past the first few sections, and paused. The tabs were clean, untouched. Too clean. Section 14 was there, but 14.2 gone. The color drained from his face as he turned the page, only to find Section 15 waiting like a vulture. He flipped back, then forward, then back again like maybe the missing clause would manifest through sheer desperation. Behind him, Kayla leaned in, whispering, "Wasn't that part still under review?" Auditor didn't blink. "You appear to be missing the section tied to mandatory vendor disclosures." Derek forced a smile that looked like a cramp. "It's probably in the previous year's binder. We did a refresh in Q1, so we may have archived some." The woman held up a hand. "We're reviewing 2020 through 2023. All 3 years fall within your production obligation. The original and any revised versions are required." There was a silence that didn't feel like silence. It felt like a fuse waiting to reach the dynamite. Derek turned to Kayla. "Do we have the earlier binder?" Kayla's face flushed. "I think maybe I'll check." The man in glasses spoke up this time. "Mr. Milner, Clause 14.2 is not optional. The controls you describe in your current deck are insufficient without corresponding validation. You should have received this scope weeks ago." Derek exhaled through his nose like a man trying to summon confidence through his pores. "Look, we had some reorg turbulence. Some legacy processes were restructured, but we've streamlined things to the point where the current framework." The woman leaned forward, cutting him off with surgical precision. "Sir, streamlining is not a synonym for deletion." Someone in the corner coughed. Another team lead, Brad from Data Ops, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered, just loud enough. "Wasn't this her area? Back before the reorg?" The auditor didn't acknowledge the whisper, but I saw her ears twitch. I was still in the corner, still silent, still not acknowledged, a ghost with a badge. I sat with my legs crossed, eyes calm, hands folded in my lap. Inside, though, my blood had gone still, like a lion waiting in tall grass. Derek tried to pivot, fumbling for another tab. "Why don't we walk you through our enhanced cross-functional escalation structure?" Woman didn't move. Clause 14.2, original, revised, and the change history. "Please." She said it so politely, it was almost cruel. Derek looked to Legal. Legal stared at the table. Kayla disappeared into the hallway with her laptop like she was running from a fire. Brad stopped whispering. No one looked at me, which was good, because I wasn't ready to move yet. Not until the weight of that missing clause settled over the room like smog in July. Not until Derek had exhausted every file, every excuse, every inch of fabricated confidence. They had one job, one section, one record, and it had vanished like it never existed. Except it had. I'd written it, signed it, backed it up in triplicate, and labeled it meticulously in a folder sitting exactly 8 inches from the bottom of my purse. But I didn't flinch. Because when you've watched your work get gutted, your authority stripped, and your name buried beneath buzzwords, learn the value of patience. You don't rescue fools mid-fall, you wait for the crash, then you hand over the black box. By noon the next day, the silence had turned radioactive. You could feel it in the walls like static before a lightning strike. The auditors weren't speaking much anymore, just making requests, logging timestamps, and watching the responses land with all the impact of wet cardboard. The audit clock was ticking, literally. They'd brought a digital timer, bright red, sitting at the edge of the table like a reminder that time wasn't on our side. Every unfulfilled request added weight to the review. Every hour of delay ratcheted up the penalty tier. We were already 4 hours past the delivery window for Clause 14.2. That put us in Tier 2 territory. Substantiated gaps, insufficient substantiation, risk of omission. Next stop, regulatory intervention and mandatory remediation. A report card no company wants their clients or investors to see. Derek finally cracked. He slammed the war room door shut, called a non-mandatory emergency sync, and told everyone to cancel lunch. Half the room showed up holding half-eaten sandwiches and full plates of dread. "All right," he said, pacing like a motivational speaker whose speech was dissolving in real time. "We need to crowdsource this. Someone has to know where Clause 14.2 is filed. Think old SharePoint. Maybe someone has a PDF on their local." Kayla shook her head. "We've combed through Ops Vibes, the Q1 archive, the legacy backups. Nothing has it labeled as a separate clause." "Ops Vibes," I nearly snorted. Derek turned to legal. "Anything in your litigation hold records." Legal looked like he wanted to die. "We only retain documents marked as discovery relevant. Clause 14.2 was restructured post-reorg. So technically, Derek snapped, we're screwed." A murmur rolled across the room. No one met his eyes. That's when my phone buzzed, a single message. From his assistant, Hannah. "Do you still have the 14.2 doc? Not can you send it, not will you help? Just do you have it," like I was a time traveler carrying the last map to a lost city. I stared at the message for a solid minute, let it hang there like an unopened invitation to a party I was never supposed to attend. Then I slipped my hand into my purse and felt for the flash drive. It was still there, wrapped in the fabric I'd stitched into the lining years ago. The kind of hiding spot you make when you don't trust the cloud or the people who run it. I didn't respond to Hannah. I didn't look up. But that afternoon, I quietly plugged the drive into my locked laptop and made a copy of the restoration insurance folder. Labeled it RRB Delivery Prep and moved it to its own encrypted directory. One click, no trace. Because even if they didn't know it yet, power was shifting. Not in some loud, heroic way. Not with speeches or showdowns. But like a tide creeping up the shore, grain by grain, until it's under your feet and rising. Eric's swagger had collapsed into darting eyes and pinched brows. He paced behind the glass like a caged animal. The energy in the war room had flipped. The team wasn't backing him anymore. They were afraid of being near him when the walls came down. Brad from Data Ops leaned against the coffee station, watching me for a beat too long. Like he knew something was off. Like he remembered that Clause 14.2 had always had my name on it. Still, I said nothing, because my silence was now a weapon. A loaded chamber they didn't even know existed. And with every tick of that red digital clock, the bullet got closer to firing. Day 3 began like a wake, quiet, grim, and overcaffeinated. The war room had been stripped of its startup optimism. No more bagels, no more slogans on the whiteboard. Someone had even removed the Get Compliant, Stay Cool poster, probably out of shame. The red audit clock sat center stage now, linking 27:43:16. Each second felt like a countdown to public humiliation. The regulators were deep into their document review, leafing through sanitized folders filled with hollow versions of policies I had once pored over with legal, security, and third-party risk. The guts were gone. All that remained were buzzwords wrapped in compliance cosplay. At 10:06 a.m., the lead auditor, clipboard woman with the steel bun, lifted her gaze. No expression, no emotion. She spoke for the first time that morning, voice even direct. "Miss Carver." The room stopped. Somewhere behind me a chair creaked. Someone dropped a pen. I looked up. "You handled internal controls prior to the operational restructure, correct?" Derek jumped in too fast. "Actually, I can clarify. Pamela's role was more, let's say, archival, supportive. She's no longer in." The woman raised a hand. "Mr. Milner, you've reviewed the change logs." Her eyes didn't leave mine. She was the signatory on Clause 14.2 from its inception through Q1 of this year. That predates the modification and constitutes a primary authorship role. We'd like her response directly. Derek sank back in his seat, face a shade paler than usual. A silence followed, but not the awkward kind. It was surgical. All eyes turned toward me. I stood calm. I didn't rush, didn't smooth my blouse or adjust my ID badge or make a show of nervousness. I'd prepared for this moment like a surgeon scrubbing in. "Would it help," I said carefully, "if I shared a supplemental record of the original clause, including change history, linked attestations, and vendor compliance trails through 2023? The clipboard woman nodded once. That would be acceptable. The man in glasses clicked his pen. Clock paused, he said, typing into the laptop connected to the red timer. 27:43:16 froze on the screen. A sharp inhale moved through the room like wind shifting before a storm. Nobody blinked. Nobody moved. Derek made a sound, something between a cough and a protest, but Legal touched his shoulder, a subtle panic grab that meant, "Stop, you've already done enough." Kayla didn't look up. Brad stared at the floor like it owed him an apology. Power dynamic inverted in a single sentence. I was no longer a ghost in the corner. I was the only person in the room with the thing they needed. Everything in that moment slowed, heartbeat, breath, the distant hum of the HVAC. I walked to the end of the table, set my notebook down, calmly pulled the flash drive from my pocket, held it between my thumb and forefinger like a scalpel in a sterile room. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. But inside I felt it. Tectonic shift. The weight sliding off my chest. The moment when being invisible transformed into being inevitable. They thought I was the past. Turns out I was the record. I placed the flash drive on the table like a surgeon setting down a scalpel after a clean cut. No flourish, no drama, just precise, unshakable calm. The label on the side read in clear black font, Vendor Controls, 2018-2023 annotated, Auth. P. Carver. Auditor reached for it without a word, plugged it into the secured laptop they'd brought, and began navigating the folder structure I'd spent 18 months refining in private. Every file was named, versioned, and cross-referenced. PDFs paired with original Word docs. Audit trails with timestamps. Redline comparisons. Attestations with signatures. Even a changelog that showed exactly when Derek's team had overwritten the clause language and what had been stripped in the process. I hadn't left anything to chance. I hadn't just saved the documentation, I'd anticipated the question. The clipboard woman leaned forward, eyes scanning. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the faintest shift in her posture. The way her shoulders uncoiled. Her pen stopped tapping. She clicked into a subfolder, 14.2 Data Localization Virlo Subprocessor Flow. Then another, Third-Party Risk Assessments Cordatech HIPAA Addendum signed. Each click echoed like a verdict. She turned to her colleague, who nodded once and typed something into the laptop. Then she said it, 4 words, soft, surgical, devastating, clock stops, material record located. The digital timer blinked once and froze for good. 27:43:16 final. And just like that, the audit pressure valve hissed and released. You could feel the air shift in the room. Shoulders dropped, breaths resumed. Except Derek hadn't moved. He just stared at the screen, like if he blinked it would disappear. Like he still couldn't believe I'd done what his whole team had failed to do. He looked, for the first time in his expensive, overconfident tenure, like a man untethered. Legal leaned toward him, murmured something I couldn't hear. He nodded slowly, not really seeing. Then Legal rose and gently guided him out of the room like you'd walk a dazed man away from a car crash. Didn't look back, he didn't say thank you, he didn't say anything. Kayla sat 2 seats away, tapping her nails against a now pointless printout. She didn't meet my eyes. Brad coughed, then busied himself organizing cables that didn't need organizing. Someone from Data Ops mumbled something about taking a break and practically ran out of the room. But me, I stayed right where I was. I returned to my seat, sat down, crossed my legs, poured myself a fresh cup of lukewarm coffee from the tray they hadn't refreshed since yesterday. Stirred in 1 sugar. No cream. The clipboard woman offered a nod, not warmth, not friendship, just the kind of professional acknowledgement that means, you did the job. You did it right. You knew it all along, that was enough. I didn't need praise. I didn't need applause. I had the record. I had the receipts. And now, so did they. In the silence that followed, War Room felt like a church after a confession. Quiet, heavy, holy in its own bureaucratic way. And the woman they'd ignored, sidelined, and erased, she was the only one who'd shown up with the truth. Derek never came back. By the time the audit team wrapped up their review, the board had already launched an internal investigation, quietly at first, then very publicly. Compliance failures at his level weren't just inconvenient, were liabilities with consequences measured in shareholder lawsuits and breach disclosures. Within 48 hours, a statement went out. Certisage Systems has placed VP of Operations Derek Milner on administrative leave pending a full review of procedural oversight during the audit preparation process. The rest of us didn't need the translation. He was done. The fallout came fast and clean, like someone had finally remembered where the scalpel drawer was. His Fastlane vendorization program, suspended. Ops vibes, archived and locked. Kayla was reassigned politely with phrases like better alignment, but we all knew what it meant. Brad from Data Ops started showing up to meetings on time again. And me? I got an email from the CEO's office that simply read, "Pamela, can we schedule time to discuss a leadership opportunity in risk and governance?" I didn't respond immediately. I let them wait a day, not out of pettiness, but because I needed to finish cleaning up the audit logs from Derek's last 6 months. It felt right, like scrubbing out the final traces of mildew before laying new tile. When I finally walked into the executive floor, it was surreal. The same faces who once treated me like outdated software were now nodding, smiling, offering chairs and coffee and words like crucial and indispensable. The meeting ended with a new title, a new budget, a new office, 3 doors down from where Derek's nameplate had already been scraped off the wall. My first act as executive director of risk and governance. I implemented what I called the restoration protocol, a new internal policy that mandated all business units maintain real-time audit-readiness documentation, complete with version histories, authorship trails, and quarterly verification audits. No exceptions. No streamlining. No Canva PDFs. It became known internally as the Carver Rule. Some folks grumbled, others adjusted, but the smart ones, they started listening a little closer when I spoke. And that flash drive, the one that saved the company, the one that carried 18 months of proof when no one believed I had value left, I still carry it, not out of paranoia, out of principle. I walked past Derek's old office later that week, now hollow and repainted in corporate beige. Glass walls were scrubbed of any trace of him. The oversized chair, the framed move fast, think big poster, the empty desk. I paused for just a second. The flash drive in my pocket pressed against my hip like a pocket knife you never really stop carrying. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself smile. Not out of vengeance, not even satisfaction, but because I knew what they finally knew. Sometimes the quiet ones aren't keeping their heads down. They're keeping the receipts. Big thanks, you legends of the old office days. Subscribe to keep the switch-flicking chaos alive. Your ex-boss is shaking in their loafers.